Good morning, everyone, or evening, apologies, it's been a day. My name is Kimberly Roa Tejera. I am the Special Projects Coordinator at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, and we are so excited to have you all here today for this afternoon Tertulia, Puerto Rican Studies in CUNY's the first 50 years. Joining us today are the book's editors, Dr. Virginia Sanchez-Korrol and Dr. María E. Pérez y Gonzalez, as well as Dr. Conor Reed, Dr. Edna Acosta-Belen, and Dr. María Kanino, who are editor or contributors to the book, in discussing the latest creation, Puerto Rican Studies in the City University of New York, the first 50 years. They will also be discussing the importance of the legacy that Puerto Rican Studies has on CUNY. This conversation will be moderated by Ricardo Gabriel. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, once again, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ricardo Gabriel. I am a PhD candidate in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center, an inter-university program for Latino research / Mellon Dissertation Fellow, and an alum of the Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies Department at Hunter College. I'm honored to be in conversation today with María Elizabeth Pérez y Gonzalez, Associate Professor in the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College, CUNY, and a former longtime chairperson of the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College. Virginia Sanchez-Korrol, Professor Emerita at Brooklyn College and another longtime chairperson of the Department of Puerto Rican and Latino Studies at Brooklyn College. Edna Acosta-Belen, Distinguished Professor Emerita of Latin American, Caribbean, and U.S. Latino Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at the University at Albany, SUNY. Conor Tomás Reed, instructor at Brooklyn College and co-founding participant in Free CUNY and Rank and File Action. And María Josefa Kanino Arroyo, Professor Emerita of Public Administration at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Excuse me. We will be discussing Puerto Rican Studies in the City University of New York, the first 50 years, an important new publication from Central Press. We're going to start off by going around and having the panelists briefly discuss their contributions to the book. Then we'll jump into a discussion before opening it up for Q&A. So please, if you have questions throughout the event, type them in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end of the event. So Professor Pérez y Gonzalez, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Saludos, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. I'm so thrilled to be here. In terms of the book came about as a result of a discussion with Dr. Prudence Cumberbatch, who is my colleague here at Brooklyn College and is currently Africana Studies Chair. When I was chair in the fall of 2018, we were discussing next steps. And so I said, wow, I really, I'm going to get back to my research finally after so long. And she suggested, well, the 50th anniversary is coming up. Why don't you do a special Centro Journal, a 50th anniversary of Puerto Rican Studies? And I said, that's a great idea. So, of course, the first person I thought of was my friend, colleague, and mentor, Virginia Sanchez-Korrol. I called her up, we made the proposal, and it turned out into a book. Rather, the Centro Press suggested, a book instead. And here we are. And so I think it's just one other... una señal, sorry, I'm not supposed to be bilingual. One sign, right, that what the book shows about Puerto Rican studies being a collaborative effort along with Black studies, Africana studies, that even the book idea came about as a discussion with my friend and colleague, right, an African-American scholar. So I really appreciate that, and I've learned a lot from this book, so I hope we get to discuss so much more about the book. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Sanchez-Korrol? I'm sorry, I think you're muted, Professor.
Unmute. Okay, hi everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to take my extra minute now because somebody muted me. And that's hard to do. So Yes, exactly as Professor Pérez y Gonzalez explained to you, but there were so many other things that were involved in getting this book together. When she came up with the idea, it reminded me that many, many years ago, when I was a young faculty member in the department, the current chairperson was María Sanchez. And María Sanchez was my mentor and one of the most important, significant persons that I had ever met in the field. And she was a friend and colleague as well. And we had at Brooklyn College, at that time, I came into the department in 1978. Figure it out, 1978. The department was just getting on its feet after having spent years in long struggles for survival. And she was hoping that we would be on an even keel from that point on. Of course, we never were, because we're Puerto Rican Studies. And she had said to me, I don't want you to get involved in any of the struggles. What I want you to do is I want you to put us on the map. And how many years later, 30 years later, on our 50th anniversary, I felt that this book was the way that we could not only put ourselves from Brooklyn on the map, we could put Puerto Rican studies as it is practiced and as it has evolved over the decades everywhere that it is taught. And that's how I came on to work on the project. And the interesting thing about it was that the pandemic gave us the time to actually work very closely on what we wanted this book to represent. And we were just fortunate all the way through this project that we not only had pioneers in the field who worked with us by writing articles in the book, but we also were able to reach out to beyond CUNY and bring in people like our colleagues, María Kanino and Edna Acosta-Belen, who are with us today.
Great, thank you. Professor Acosta-Belen.
She may be muted as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Ahora sí.
Okay, even the picture looks a little bit dark. I can't understand why. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here with you all, and although I would have preferred to, seeing you in person, because after almost 2.5 years, I haven't been able to visit Central, and it has even been longer that I haven't seen some of you and some of my old friends, and be able to give you a big Puerto Rican style hug. So it's nice to be here. I'm not going to be, talking about my essays. I'll mention briefly what I tried to do in both of them. Originally, it was supposed to be only one essay, but it ended up being too long. And the editors very nicely, asked me to cut it down, which was practically an impossibility. And then we concluded that it was better to do 2 essays. One of them focuses actually on the the scholarship that has been produced during the last 50 years in the various programs, and some of the obstacles that we confronted early on. And the other essay deals specifically with the non-CUNY programs, because not everybody's aware that even though CUNY had most of the Puerto Rican Studies programs in the 1970s, there were programs that were established at SUNY, State University of New York, the research centers of Albany and Buffalo and Stony Brook. There was Rutgers University, Livingston College, And then after that, you know, the program that's in New Brunswick now. There's the University of Connecticut Puerto Rican Studies Institute that came into the picture actually more than a decade or a decade and a half after the early programs. And there's also activity in the area, Chicago area, that took place at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and also at DePaul University, because they had Puerto Rican studies specialists in their faculty. And they were housed under Latino and Latin American studies. So I tried to cover those different sites that were involved in the Puerto Rican studies movement early on and in later years. And so they can be also recognized.
Thank you. Yes, Professor Reed.
All right. Hello, everyone. First, I want to share gratitude to El Centro, to the editors, María, Pérez y Gonzalez, and Virginia Sanchez-Korrol for really stewarding such an incredible book into being. The participants here, the interpreters, and all of you in the audience for choosing to be here with us today. I wrote a chapter called The Evolution of Puerto Rican Studies at City College, and I'd like to share a little bit about it. So I was a City College student from 2006 to 2010, and I was deeply immersed in the campus's legacies of the 1969 Black and Puerto Rican campus takeover, their 5 demands, the creation of Harlem University, and how the struggle really transformed CUNY through the creation of open admissions, ethnic and gender studies, and CUNY's relationship to broader movements. So even though City College was one of the first CUNY schools to develop Puerto Rican studies, and even though New York City concentrates a huge number of Nuyorican and Diasporicans, believe it or not, the official archives of Puerto Rican studies fit into one single box in the City College library. So much had been forgotten, lost, or unsung about these historic actions that became embedded into City College as a radical discipline. So I interviewed 3 present and emeritus scholars at City, Sherry Baver, Gabriel Haslip Vieira, and Iris Lopez. I also poured through student newspapers, library archives, movement communiques, scholarship. I learned that Puerto Rican studies at City College transformed by attending to the shifting migrations over time of Caribbeans and Latin Americans to New York City. It's now called Latin American and Latino Studies. In its most robust moments, Puerto Rican studies was actively engaged with social struggles in our city, in the country, and on the island of Puerto Rico. However, the Puerto Rican Studies Department, which is now a program, has also since its formation been beset with all kinds of backlash by the administration, all kinds of defunding and competition for resources with other programs and departments there. I learned that at City College in 1970, against a demand for third world studies by Black and Puerto Rican students and supportive Euro-descended students, faculty, community members, staff, that the administration quashed this coalitional demand for third world studies by dividing up Asian American, Black, Puerto Rican, and Jewish studies. So I think this is a useful provocation or even debate for us 50 years later. Do we want autonomy, solidarity? How is one intention sometimes pitted against the other to sabotage both by those in power? How closely are we learning from each other? In this way, Puerto Rican studies, while intellectually thriving in many ways, is still resisting its colonized status, even as it has been long institutionalized. And this is perhaps an allegory through which we could discuss the politics of statehood, independence, and transnational liberation. I have much more to say, but I want to give that initial introduction to my chapter.
Thank you, Conor. Finally, last but certainly not least, Professor Kanino.
I echo Conor's welcome to everyone. It's truly a pleasure to see old colleagues and new ones. Conor, I'm a City College graduate. It's my alma mater, right? But I graduated in '64, and that tells you I've been around a while. And I also visited with City College students during the takeover in 1969. I was a trustee on the Board of Higher Ed, City University, over a period of 10 years in 2 different blocks of time. But I was put on the board as a attempt at co-opting the younger Puerto Rican first generation New Yorkers. But that's a whole other story, but I'm very pleased to have been asked to be here. My role, I reviewed the manuscript and I wrote a blurb on the book jacket, and I was invited to make comments at the end of the rich discussion, which I hope the authors will have, and my comments will be limited to the end of the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you all. There are many themes in the book which we could talk about for hours. I have tons of questions. I know we all have a lot to say. This is a very important topic. But in our limited time, I want to start off by having you all ground us a bit with a discussion about the original need for and mission of Puerto Rican studies. According to your research and/or experience as practitioners during its founding, what should people watching and listening today know about the original mission and goals of Puerto Rican studies? And feel free to jump in, whoever wants to start first.
Okay. All right, let me start on this then. Well, the goals of Puerto Rican studies are goals that I think everyone understands today, as well as they understood them back then 50 years ago. It was extremely important living in a country that rendered you invisible, rendered you and your community ahistorical, a community that living in communities that were concerned with education, but were not getting an education for a myriad of reasons. I think that one of our most important articles, they're all very important, but the one that stands out in my mind at this particular point is the article on bilingual education and how we not only created Puerto Rican studies to open the roads to our communities into the university, but in the article on bilingual education, you also begin to understand that we also created the movement for bilingual education then, and it continues to this day. It was a very, very important moment for us who were disenfranchised, to stake a claim in the university, so that the reasons why are very obvious. We are fortunate that we have a film on the Brooklyn experience, which speaks for all of our experiences in storming the castles and storming our way into it. That's a story that we know, and we know that story well. Conor has written about it beautifully. It appears in the book because it is a major factor. The film about the Puerto Rican students and the takeover that created Puerto Rican Studies at Brooklyn College is one of the most important films that has come out this year. But the book also does more than talk about our beginnings. What happened then? What happened after the students rammed their way into the university? How did programs in Puerto Rican Studies begin? We didn't have faculty that were trained to teach something called Puerto Rican Studies, which was interdisciplinary, intersectional, dealt with gender, dealt with issues of race and culture. How did these early professors begin to craft together a department, an area of study that would last 50 years and would reappear in its various incarnations throughout those 50 years as we learned more, added more, formed more coalitions, began to see that what we were supporting was something that was transnational, something that crossed the boundaries, something that morphed into Latino studies, something that was akin to Mexican American studies. That period in time is a period that historically is unknown. And that is one of the important contributions, I feel, that our writers have made. How it was that we created departments and programs, how it was that we had to fight against affirmative action, how it was that we had to fight for validity, even among the faculties, even in spite of the fact that our earliest faculty were well prepared and had achieved the highest of PhD, the highest honor, the highest rank that you could achieve in academia. How did we have to continue to fight Americanization? How did we continue to bolster our departments? And how it was that we went our own separate ways without caving into any other discipline. Instead of caving into other disciplines or becoming like other disciplines began to emulate what we were doing. So for starters, that's a point of view that very, very seldom people have. We just don't know that history. And one of the problems that Maria and I faced in putting the book together was that we didn't have many pioneers left. Many of them were no longer with us. We wanted to study departments of Puerto Rican studies from the very, very beginning as they emerged in various college campuses, but the archives were not there. We were very fortunate, Conor, that at City College, we had archives. At Brooklyn College, we had archives. At Albany, we had archives. We were able to begin to piece the story together in such a way that required a great deal of research of our writers. And again, we were just fortunate that we got the best people in the field to write for us. So, Maria?
Yes, I'd just like to follow up quickly. The chapter I wrote, how a few students transformed the ivory tower, Puerto Rican Studies and its evolution at Brooklyn College, coincides so nicely with the documentary that Virginia referred to, the Making the Impossible Possible, the story of Puerto Rican Studies at Brooklyn College, put together by our founding alum and by one of our students as well, and some allies. And so I just wanted to make APRE, APREE.org. You can actually find the film there, the trailer and all of that. And you can see it at Brooklyn College or at CUNY if you are if you have a CUNY First ID. So just to let you know that, but it's fabulous. And what I learned through this is exactly what Virginia was talking about, that students wanted to see themselves in the academy. They had learned, right? And were learning about Euro-American history, but what about the history of other peoples? Right? What about the history of African Americans, of Puerto Ricans? And so the origins of Puerto Rican studies was a quest for self-affirmation, identity, the hunger for knowledge about who we are, where we come from. But it wasn't merely about just focusing on Puerto Rico. While that was important because that was our heritage and our roots, it was about establishing what the diaspora was like, right? The diasporic experience and how that played itself out and the changes that people go through, right? That a culture and a peoples go through and language goes through, right? When you go and you move from one place, right, to another. So Puerto Rican studies was also, let's not forget, about independence for Puerto Rico. That was part of the heart of what it was about who gets to decide, right, your future, who gets to speak about it and talk about it, discuss it, make those decisions. And so Puerto Rican studies was very much aligned with that cause for independence for Puerto Rico. And it sort of demonstrated itself, revealed itself in the struggle for Puerto Rican studies, establishing that, right, through the students, the faculty and the staff and allies, right, that were not Puerto Rican, other Latinxes, African Americans, Jewish students, progressive students, white students, right, Asian students. So it was so important to Puerto Rican studies to come along, right, in coalition building, but also to bring out and to bring to the fore the struggle for Puerto Rico's independence. So that some of that has sort of lost its way somewhat, right? But that was a lot of Puerto Ricans, right, who joined that struggle. Were very adamant about that being that Puerto Rico's case had to be studied and discussed and pushed forward, right, so that people would know more about it. And I'll be quiet now and let someone else chime in.
May I?
Yes, please.
Yes, another aspect of what we did early on, and we were starting from scratch because there wasn't even a solid body of knowledge about Puerto Rican migration or the Puerto Rican diaspora that could be used. Most of those studies that existed at the time were focused on deficit models of the community, concepts like culture of poverty or the Puerto Rican problem discourses. Actually, there's a new book that Edgardo Melendez will publish soon. It should be out probably in a month or two, that actually documents all those narratives of the Puerto Rican problem and how they evolved through time and their origins, which is actually, in part, some of the studies that non-Puerto Ricans, mostly Anglo scholars or foreign scholars, did about the Great Migration, which, if when you read them and take them as a whole, you'll see that they continue to recycle the same stereotypical and deficit models about the Puerto Rican migration and the Puerto Rican community, especially in New York at the time. So one of the things that we started doing through Centro first, and then through some of the work done by the various faculty in the different programs, was trying to produce the kind of research that were decolonize that knowledge that was out there that didn't give a complete picture of the experiences and the contributions of Puerto Rican migration and the U.S. communities to different aspects of U.S. life, you know, economically, socially, culturally. All of that was not known outside, you know, the smaller circles in the community, usually the academics or other professional organizations, but not in the schools. Nothing like that was taught. So from the first decade, we started trying to produce, you know, that kind of scholarship. It was also thought that Puerto Ricans had arrived, you know, in the during the Great Migration of the mid-20th century, and we discovered in the 80s, thanks to the release of the Memorias de Bernardo Vega and Virginia's wonderful book on the early Puerto Rican community, that was not the case, that there was a lot of information that was not known to most of us. I had to be a nurse. That was found in many of the publications and Spanish language newspapers in the city that nobody had paid attention to. So we tried to look through those publications and extract writings and other types of material to show, you know, that that Puerto Ricans had a community that had been active at all levels, not only culturally, but also, you know, in fighting for their rights, for social justice, etc., and that we had leaders in the community who had done that. All the previous scholars who, you know, could have done that if they have bothered to look at some of these publications, but they didn't pay much attention to it. They continued to recycle the same narratives, and it took a while to be able to at least find one decent, you know, textbook that we could use in Puerto Rican studies courses.
And I'm glad you mentioned this, because I wanted to ask you all precisely about the lack of books on Puerto Ricans in the diaspora at the time that were written by Puerto Ricans in English that could be used to teach about the Puerto Rican experience. I mean, in chapter 7, you discuss this. Juan Gonzalez also addresses it in his chapter.
Right. Yeah.
And we know that developing curriculum for Puerto Rican studies departments was a central task of El Centro, but the Centro wasn't founded until 1973.
Right.
So how did faculty overcome this challenge in the initial 3 or 4 years of Puerto Rican studies at CUNY and at Rutgers in the case of Professor Kanino? Who created these materials? Where did they come from?
Oh, I think we're laughing about we're not laughing at you. We're remembering what we had to do in order to create materials.
Yeah.
You see, anything that we wanted to teach was in Spanish.
Yes.
We had to translate material, and then we had to mimeograph. Do you know what a mimeograph is?
No, they don't.
They don't.
I want to say yes, but no, I don't.
You don't, because it hasn't been used in 40 years.
Very messy process.
And you had to then put this machine up. Do you remember Maria Kanino?
Yes.
A mimeograph, all right?
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
Getting our materials translated, and then it was an early form of Xeroxing.
Yeah.
And the blue ink would be all over your hands. And you then had these papers that you would hand out to your students as the reading material that they had to read. There were no films that you could show. Many of our students were not really Spanish speakers. They certainly could not read in Spanish, although we did teach some courses in Spanish. But it wasn't until Centro began to actually put out los cuadernos, remember? Collections of articles that were then distributed to faculty in the city university system. I don't know, Edna, if you use them also because you were working.
Oh yeah, we used to get them from Centro.
We used to get them from Centro, right? And then that became what we were using before those were actually published into books. One of the earliest books that comes out of the cuadernos, these were, again, how do you define cuadernos? They're also mimeographed. They're printed sheets put together into a book, right? And one of the first books that came out of that, an actual book, was a migration under capitalism.
Labor migration.
Labor migration under capitalism that comes out of Centro.
Yeah.
The first international conference on Puerto Rican studies took place 10 years after the founding of Puerto Rican Studies departments, and it was held at Brooklyn College. And that was one of the key issues, was what are we going to do in order to publish? You see, our work, it didn't come easy for us to publish because many of our colleagues thought that we were all affirmative action hires, and that therefore we didn't have the educational background to actually produce a book. So that the struggle was very, very little baby steps to get to a point where we could finally have the type of departments that I don't think you guys were used to. I don't think that I think that that type of struggle and that type of commitment required a great deal of passion for what we were doing in order to accomplish what you guys have inherited.
Yes.
Just would like to add that the importance of teaching in the first years of Puerto Rican studies is the innovative style that we used in teaching. One were small groups and relying on the students' experiences themselves. We did a lot of talking about our experiences in different parts of New Jersey. For example, the student who came from a migrant family working on the farms was different from the student in Newark who had come in from the riots and been admitted to the university. And so sharing stories and having the instructor elicit what were the lines of analysis in terms of colonialism, in terms of oppression, in terms of poverty, and structural racism was part of the teaching experience. And I think that was a rich part of the first decade, I would say. We also relied on other authors. I used Memi, Fanon.
Oh, yes.
Right.
And
yes.
And others who inspired students, because there was literature in English, especially written by African Americans and Native Americans. So we had reading materials, but that was not the only way to learn, and we learned that rapidly.
Yes, that's amazing.
Well, may I add something else?
Sure.
Yes, and at the time there wasn't either a literature written in English by Puerto Rican writers of the diaspora. This came gradually, actually, and just by the end of the first decade, we had a few readings that we could use, especially from the New Yorker poets and the work of Piri Thomas, for example.
Yes.
And then, came also early on in the mid-70s, and Nicolas Amor and her novels. I remember she was the first writer of the diaspora that I interviewed and invited to Albany, because having her novel I wanted to bring her to campus and have the students meet her and talk to her about her work. And it was terrific for me because we became long time, lifetime friends, basically. But that that was another thing that I feel helped after the literature, especially the creative literature, became available in English or in Spanglish.
Yes. Okay, thank you all for sharing that. I have about 4 minutes before I'm supposed to end this segment and open it up for Q&A. We only have one question so far in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask again for folks listening and watching to type your questions into the Q&A chat. In the meantime, I'm going to sneak in a huge question and hope that we can get to it a little bit. Besides, as we've discussed already, the need for representation and self-affirmation through Puerto Rican studies, we know that another central mission of Puerto Rican studies was activist research and education for community empowerment, right? And we know that Puerto Rican studies played a historic role, has played a historic role in supporting movements for social justice in the university, in our diaspora communities, and for Puerto Rican decolonization and self-determination. So I'd like to ask, and this can carry over into the Q&A, what are some of the issues and struggles that Puerto Rican studies scholars and students are currently involved in at CUNY or in the diaspora more broadly that you want to bring attention to? And how can Puerto Rican studies scholars and students bring more attention to current urgent policy issues such as the privatization of Puerto Rico's energy system? We know that there was another huge blackout just last night in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps collaborate with organizers, activists, and others already doing the work to actually resist these policies. Pedro Caban, in his chapter, says that Puerto Rican studies is most vibrant when Puerto Rico is in crisis. Well, Puerto Rico is always under crisis, right? We're always under threat and existential threats now, especially with this mass displacement of Puerto Ricans, the selling off of the archipelago. So how can Puerto Rican studies play a role in bringing attention to these issues and actually resisting some of these policies?
May I jump in to share some thoughts?
Please do.
Sure.
So I'm just amazed at all of this incredible context. I mean, we are getting a deep download of the creation of Puerto Rican studies, and in particular, this way that Puerto Rican studies had given such careful attention to thinking comparatively about colonialism. And so learning from the different anti-colonial struggles in the continent of Africa, in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Asia, and Pacific Islands, Puerto Rico has very much had a keen focus on thinking about colonialism, but not just the conditions on one island. And I think through that kind of prism of Puerto Rican solidarity and Puerto Rican studies, that has also meant that we have had a really abundant record of struggles related to feminist, anti-racist movement work, related to the environment, neoliberal austerity, labor. And so I'm grateful for your question, Ricardo. At CUNY and in New York City, we have really tried to bridge solidarity lessons with the University of Puerto Rico and the island in an ongoing way as family. In particular, over the last 20 years, we supported the uprisings in Vieques, halting the gasoducto pipeline. This was around 2011, 2012. The multiple University of Puerto Rico strikes, 2010, 11, 15, 17, 19, resisting Promesa, the fraudulent colonial debt. We in New York and in CUNY have tried to support the network of mutual aid centers after Hurricane Maria, the Centros de Apoyo Mutuo, the uprisings that Auste Rosselló, a lot of the feminist, queer, and trans organizing, groups like Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, shuttered schools that are now being repurposed, for example, La Conde. There are groups doing popular education through arts and theater, Papel Machete and Agitarte. And then recently, these mass teacher strikes, all working to oppose privatization, gentrification, the lack of COVID care. And so I lay out some of these different examples because, as Ricardo's question suggests, the island of Puerto Rico is still one of our best movement schools. And so all of these different kinds of ways that Puerto Ricans are struggling on the island is very much something for us to learn here and for us to support here, being in the epicenter of global capitalism. Many of the people who are sustaining Promesa, the boot on the neck of Puerto Rico, have offices here. They have addresses. There are people in these various institutions who we can challenge. And I think that there's a way that Puerto Rican studies, very much in the present, it shouldn't just be about interpreting our conditions as a people. The point is to change those conditions. And so Puerto Rican studies in the past and even into the present has been this hub of thinking about how to enact these kinds of changes. And as my colleague Maria had said earlier, this is very much done in alliance, in coalition with people who are also trying to figure out how to get the boot off of their necks. And so I think if there's anything that 50 years on that we can really celebrate, is that this has been a continuous struggle and that we've been building lessons in the process. And that, you know, as the recent outage of power shows, very much we need to enhance the kind of support that we're able to give.
Thank you, Conor.
Oh, I'm
yes,
sorry.
please. No, please jump in. I was going to ask for a couple quick answers to that, and then we do have some questions in the Q&A that we should get to.
Just to jump in a little bit, Juan Gonzalez in his chapter, he does talk about the institutionalization, and so does Pedro Cabang in his chapter. But in terms of what Juan is saying, and I think Pedro alludes to anyway, but with the many struggles that we have in departments of Puerto Rican Studies or Puerto Rican and Latino Studies, there's not much time to get so involved with community struggles and, you know, Puerto Rico struggles and international struggles as we'd like, I think. And I think that's important because the institutionalization of Puerto Rican studies, right, not completely, but it does make it harder, right, when we have challenges with being understaffed, right? Not having enough faculty, not having enough resources, trying to put things together, to string things together on a shoestring budget, right? Trying to weave silk out of you know, almost nothing. So, you know, our efforts as faculty, right, is often very difficult to get involved in those activist movements because we're trying to survive and make sure Puerto Rican studies, Latino studies survives, you know, in the academy. So that's something that yeah, we've had to pay a price on that end, various of us, you know, so I think that's important to bring up because it does limit, right, our ability to do that. Some of us get to do it, some of us, you know, but some of us don't because we're trying to struggle to get tenure, or we're trying to struggle to make it through, to sort of, you know, to make sure that we have what we need for our students and our departments. So those are really institutional challenges because even though we've been around for now, right, 50 something years, institutions still don't prioritize Puerto Rican studies, Black studies, you know, Asian studies, etc. They just don't. There's a lot of diversity talk, but no resources, real true commitment to what we do, what we've been about, you know, and our mission. Even though the talk is there, the actions are not there.
I think that might be Maria's bringing up one of the contradictions, right? Because Puerto Rican Studies was born out of advocacy, was born out of militancy, and not just students. I mean, we formed a cadre, at least at Livingston College in my experience, and certainly as a trustee, I saw it in all of the campuses, the many issues, Hostos, Brooklyn, Lehman, every campus had issues. And the question we have to ask ourselves, future researchers, students, and scholars and community, is in our current assessment of Puerto Rican studies. Puerto Rican studies was, but does it continue to be a political and cultural project, as well as an academic interdiscipline? What have we lost in these 50 odd years? I'm in Puerto Rico now. I retired here in 2002. Retired is a sort of the wrong word. I came here and directed the first PhD in policy analysis. But the University of Puerto Rico, for example, is under tremendous assault. And it has lost 50% of its budget in the last 3 years. There's no way to operate a public institution of the caliber of UPR under those circumstances. And what's happening is advocacy is occurring in the nonprofit sector. It's occurring in groups that form Jornada Sin Promesa, de la Construcción Feminista, and on and on. Young people buying farms, 1 acre farms, and starting to grow coffee. There is a movement afoot, and the academy is not the only place for advocacy. And I think that's important to realize. The things have changed, but I do think we have to ask the question of the impact of institutionalization, of legitimation. We have some wonderful scholars now that we didn't have in the 70s or the 80s, producing new knowledge. How do we integrate that new knowledge into policy analysis and teaching and advocacy? I think it's a challenge. We had to fight for tenure in the first 2025, and we're still fighting for tenure. I saw the data on CUNY. We only have 10% Hispanic faculty, and that includes Dominican, Puerto Rican, Cubano faculty. 10% in 50 years. It's just mind-boggling that we are still a minority in a city that's 26% Latino. So I think we have a lot of questions to ask ourselves going forward, among which one is the question of the continuity and discontinuities, and what have we lost? What have we gained? And where do we have to redirect?
And I think that's one of the reasons why the book's publication at this point in time is important. Because we tend not to look backwards. We tend to move ahead without realizing that there are certain goals and certain issues that have to be dealt with. I think that an assessment of Puerto Rican studies needs to be taken nationwide every 10 years to see if we're accomplishing these aims, or have we changed our aims? Are we no longer interested in those goals? I think we are. And about student activism, I'm very, very pleased when I see that many of the young people that are involved in the activism that Conor is talking about have had a background in Puerto Rican studies, because I think that our students are introduced at the get-go into issues and problems that they have to deal with. And they become activists, and they become very, very well aware of who the players are very early on, because they are brought to that realization by the type of work that we're doing in our courses, and in Africana, in women's studies, in those departments that question.
Yeah, in our dedication page, as well as in Andres Torres's last chapter of the book, pretty much the last line is, our Pearls students give us hope. And it's through them that we survive and live and breathe our legacy.
And Andy Torres really echoes the same thing at the final line of the articles in the book.
Speaking of Andy, he has the first question, which I'll pose now. We only have about 10 minutes for the Q&A, so maybe this could be a bit of a lightning round. Andy would like to know, I would like to know too, as a matter of fact, about the career prospects of young Boricua academics in higher education going forward.
How many minutes? I think Edna was telling me something very interesting about the newspapers of the student groups in Albany. And I had wanted to ask how many of those students, what do they do? What kind of professions? How are we training them? And I think that there's the student papers are very important to see where they began and where they are today.
Yeah, the early ones, the early graduates in Puerto Rican Studies, the ones that I have, that I kept track of for a long time, they actually went to graduate school to get advanced degrees.
Yes.
Some of them in professional areas, social work, library science, counseling, also in education. Some of them became scholars, faculty members, researchers, and teachers. Actually, one of our PhD students in Albany is now at Brooklyn College.
Right.
La Santa Maria, she's up
Santa
there.
Maria.
Right.
Yeah.
My student. Many other cases like that. What is very clear is that we created in Puerto Rican Studies students who were motivated to give back to their communities. So they pursued careers that they thought would help them in that process. We, from Albany, I remember a couple of our students getting law degrees. Some of them interested in dealing with the immigration law, especially when New York City began to change in terms of the composition of the Latino population in the city, and things like that. So, it was in Albany and Buffalo, for example, it was a little bit different, and also Stony Brook, because we were at research institutions, not undergraduate colleges. Therefore, that allowed us to be a little bit more creative, not only offering the undergraduate degree, but also begin to think about some possibilities at the graduate level. And I remember, having lots of conversations with Alfredo Matillas, who was the director of the program, the Puerto Rican Studies program at Buffalo. And, we were sounding boards because we wanted to figure out the different paths that we could follow to improve our programs, or to make them attract more students, because that was always a problem for the Puerto Rican Studies programs that were not in a city with a high population of Hispanics.
Yeah.
Albany, for example, had the Tri-City area had lots of Hispanics, but they were not concentrated in any particular community.
Yeah.
So one of the first things that our program did, and Elia Hidalgo Christensen was in charge of this program, was trying to get a sense of where the community, where the different the population were, and how they could be served, and how we could get students involved with some of their organizations. And what happened is, a couple of years, we had the first, Centro Cívico Hispanoamericano in Albany, created by the efforts of students with the support of the department, that started creating their own programming to bring the community together. And it's still there, okay? 50 years
That's
later.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. We only have time for about one more question, but before, I want to, Connor made an interesting point in the chat. I want to ask if he would like to elaborate quickly.
Yeah, actually, thank you. I actually wanted to lift up a few questions from Jose in the Q&A and also Esperanza, SB. I think that the work that Centro is doing to really bring out a lot of these conversations and to not just be in the walls and halls of academia, but very much be a space of community convergence is crucial. And it really builds on the work of the Young Lords, El Comité, the Macheteros. There is very much a community-focused orientation on education that I hope that the Centro is able to continue doing. And I'm hoping that people can use this book as a resource to be able to share with your family members in study groups, to be able to circulate it as very much a living and tangible thing. So I'm hoping that people can even in the chat be able to share some ideas for how this book and conversations like this could continue while we have a lot of people here.
And just in terms of one of the other questions very quickly, the creation of Puerto Rican Studies Association, some of that background is in the book. So
Yes.
please feel
Right,
free
yes.
to look into it, delve into it. Edna Acosta-Belen touches upon it. The Brooklyn College chapter that I wrote touches upon it. So please make sure to get the book and you'll be reading more about that.
Yes. Thank
And
you.
Virginia,
add that
you wrote an
at
article on
Rutgers-
it, didn't you? For our
Were they-
journal? For our
yes.
journal. You did
Yeah.
an article on it.
Yes, yeah.
Maria Kanino, please.
Yes, just wanted to add that at Rutgers, and it's a tribute to the current faculty. It's been so creative, so innovative, and they're very committed folks. But each one has a double departmental affiliation. It presents problems at tenure time, but it also ensures that
Yeah.
people can double in terms of their academic backgrounds and contributions to the department, which is now Latino and Caribbean Studies. We haven't talked about the Murphing as
Yes.
Okay.
One of the other, just quickly, about Puerto Rican studies and, you know, the various iterations since then, which began to be mentioned, but it's also a question. The book does touch upon that. It touches upon how Puerto Rican studies, right, went to Latino studies, Latin American studies, and most of our departments no longer have Puerto Rican in it. Brooklyn College has it, I think, and Hunter. That's it. So they've every other unit has changed, and so that is a challenge, right? At Brooklyn College, there was some pressure to change to Latino studies, but you know, how can we erase our history? I can't see removing Puerto Rican from our title because it was Puerto Ricans particularly who founded it, and so adding Latino, yes, absolutely, because that's, you know, we are all Latinos, Latinxes, and that's our demographic. But that's what has happened to many of our departments, right? Either reduced to programs or the name changed completely. So we are struggling with that, you know, and many of our students are Dominican students, Mexican American, Chicano students, right? And so we have courses in our departments like that because we're Latinx studies, but that's part of the challenge, right? And because Puerto Ricans are no longer fully concentrated right in New York City, that's
Right.
another challenge that we have.
Yeah.
So that's something that we are dealing with.
Well, those are major factors, you know, the demographic composition of the area, but also the composition of the faculty at a given point in time.
Yes.
Because, you know, some of the Puerto Rican studies faculty of the early years, some moved to other institutions where they might have been teaching about Puerto Rican and Latinos, but it wasn't necessarily a Puerto Rican studies program or department. And then it was not easy to keep replacing them because you know how institutions are. When we lose a line because somebody leaves, we don't necessarily get it back right away. Sometimes we have to fight a few years to get it back.
9 years, yeah.
Yes.
I think one of the chapters that really impressed me was one of Edna's chapters when she traced what has happened to our early faculty over the years and what surprised me about that was that our early faculty began to take positions at the highest levels of academia, of administration, of organizations, of well, it's an impressive chapter if you think that that we haven't done anything in this country.
Well, you know, and the reality now is that most of Puerto Rican studies specialists are not necessarily in a Puerto Rican studies or Latino studies department. Many of them are in disciplinary departments, even though they might contribute to the interdisciplinary programs. And you know, at Albany, we had the same issue with the student population. Most of our students were Puerto Rican at the beginning for the first decade. And then we could see how it was changing when the Dominican population of New York started to increase because, you know, the university recruited many students from New York City. So especially, you know, the COP program.
I just want to say that if it was up to me, we would continue this conversation. So if the Centro folks want to cut it, you're gonna have to cut me off and cut us off because I'm gonna let the conversation keep going.
Oh yeah, our time is up.
Hi, Hi again, everyone. Thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. We are so happy and lucky to have you all here. And to also be like authors and contributors to this fantastic piece of literature. Again, thank you for your time. And we want to thank the audience for being here and for joining us in conversation. We invite you to join us again tomorrow with the Cafecito con Rocío Zambrana. This event will feature author Rocío Zambrana and her latest book, Colonial Debts. Thank you all again for your time today, and we wish you a great evening.
Thank
Adios.
you.
Nice seeing you all.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everyone.
Bye-bye.